Good evening, everybody, and welcome to this evening's event, whether you're here in person or you're joining us online. It's great to have you with us for this first event of the academic year. My name is Julian Huppert. I'm the director of the Intellectual Forum here at Jesus College. It's a great pleasure to welcome you to this wonderful place. Tonight, we're going to be talking about the history of evolution. And of course, Jesus College itself has an amazing history. Whether we would say we've evolved over that time or just changed is another question. But this was originally founded in 1144 as a nunnery, went through a change in 1496 where it became a college, and continues to change and develop. Alumni from here have gone on to make a huge difference in many ways, whether we talk about Archbishop Cranmer or Thomas Malthus, or whether we think more recently about people like Lisa Jardine or the band Clean Bandit, who some of you at least know. But Rockabye has had well over 1 billion watchers. There are many other people I could name, and in fact, we're about to come up to the 250th anniversary of the birthday of Samuel Taylor Coleridge, who was here. We'll be doing some events for that as well. The Intellectual Forum was set up much more recently. We started in 2016, and we do a number of things, including showcasing some of the amazing work that our own academics are doing and getting that out to a broader audience here in Cambridge and overseas. We've now well over 100 different countries we've had people signing in on. We'll see who's here today. And we've had amazing speakers from fashion designer Jimmy Choo to Helen Clark, who used to run New Zealand, the United Nations Development Programme. Do come on in. Most recently, we've had Laurie Adelman, who's Vice President of Global Fund for Women. And we've taken some of our academics to speak at a field in a festival alongside, or not quite at the same time as big names like Diana Ross, Nile Rodgers and Chic and the like, though I think we're in slightly smaller font. So we hope we'll see you at many of the other events that we have. And tonight is a really special and exciting night. I'm really, really delighted to have this as our very first one, because I think it will be a really nice way to start off the year. And I'm particularly pleased to welcome back Alison Bashford. And I say welcome back because Alison, although she is now out in Australia, is one of our very own. She's been a fellow here at Jesus. She's now an honorary fellow here. She used to be the Veer Harmsworth Professor here at the university and is now the wonderfully titled Laureate Professor at the University of New South Wales. So it's really wonderful to have Alison here to talk about her book, An Intimate History of Evolution, which is available in all good bookshops. If you're here in the room, we'll be selling it outside. If you're somewhere overseas, there must be good bookshops near wherever you are. I certainly hope so. So we're going to hear from Alison about what you see in the book, just in case you haven't yet memorized everything. We're then going to have a response. Professor Sujit Sivasundaram, who's Professor of World History here at the university. Sujit, it's great to have you here. We'll then have a conversation between the two of you, and then a chance to ask questions. So if you're here in person, please just raise your hand and we'll get a microphone to you. If you are watching online, type it into the Q&A feature and I will have a look and put those questions then when we get to that. So I think that's it from me. It's wonderful to have you all here. Alison, thank you so much for being with us. I'll leave the book here for you. Have a lovely time. Over to you.
Thank you. Thank you, Julian. Lovely to be here. Lovely to be back in Cambridge. Of course, wonderful to be back in Jesus College. Greetings to old friends and new, and to those of you who have kindly zoomed in. This book about the Huxleys is, as you can see in the subtitle, really squarely a book about a family. But this is a family who embodied and thought about intellectual business that happened to be about Genesis, about genetics, about generations, about genealogies, and about eugenics. And so for me, as a historian of science, this was, for a long time now, has been a family that I've wanted to track through the 19th and 20th centuries, across many generations, because they're a family that doubles as a history of ideas about evolution and inheritance. But I thought this evening I'd start more at the family end to make sure that everybody has a clear sense of who these Huxleys were beyond the most famous Aldous Huxley. And I'd like to begin at the family end, and in a way, kind of take a peek into some of their family albums, a little like an old school slide night. Let's look at the family. A cozy idea, but this family is anything but cozy. So here are the two Huxleys that I'm most interested in and around whom I've conjured and arranged this intimate history of evolution over the 19th and 20th centuries. Here they are in 1947. They're featuring on a jacket of Life magazine, one dead, one living. There's your biological fundamentals right there. At the photo shoot, and here it's taken in the Hampstead Library of Julian Huxley's home, and he's clearly really self-consciously arranging himself in, or being asked to, in front of a portrait of his grandfather. So in the foreground here, Julian Huxley was then a very well-known mid-20th century science writer, a zoologist, a humanist, a conservationist. In so many ways, Julian Huxley was David Attenborough's antecedent, and I think quite an important one, actually. And in the background there he is, a mid-19th century scientific naturalist, Thomas Henry Huxley, Darwin's most outspoken spokesman. So these two men of science, actually these self-appointed cosmologists, communicated to the world the great modern story of evolution. And for them, that included the birth, death, and rebirth, as Julian Huxley himself told the story, of the idea of natural selection. So not just evolution, but the death, birth, and rebirth of the idea, a specific idea of natural selection. They were trustees of evolution. And that's a term, the trustees of evolution, that Julian Huxley himself actually applied to all humankind, to all of us. He would say, we as humans are trustees of evolution. But in fact, the more I read that phrase, the more I decided that it applies rather more neatly to the Huxleys themselves. Well, these trustees of evolution, let's call them that, they reproduce themselves quite diligently. But not as this family would, this photograph would suggest, by some kind of asexual fission, although they were really interested in asexual reproduction, actually. But they did this in the old-fashioned manner, through sexual reproduction, and the really important player there in the reproduction culturally and biologically of the Huxley family is this woman, Julia Arnold, and through the marriage of one of the intergenerational Huxley sons and Julia Arnold, the great Huxley scientific dynasty grafts onto our great Victorian literary dynasty, the Arnolds. Matthew Arnold, two Thomas Arnolds, and were we a late 19th century audience, this would be really apparent. The first Arnold they would probably think of would be Mary Arnold, Julia's sister, who published with stratospheric success as Mrs. Humphrey Ward, the unlikely name. She was probably the late 19th century's best-selling novelist. So you've got this scientific family marrying this extraordinary literary family, the Arnolds. Aldous and Julian there, Julian's on your right, Aldous is in the middle there. These impossibly pretty Huxley sons were the offspring. Julian Huxley himself, as his career developed as a biologist and a zoologist, he really grafted himself onto his Victorian grandfather, and he pursued really signature Huxley knowledge quests. And some of those were profound and others were more like simply grandiose. But these two that I really focus on in the book, Thomas Henry and the grandson Julian, were both quite remarkable, and they were both on occasion very tortured people. They themselves publicly disclosed, this is not me publicly disclosing this, they themselves publicly disclosed a crippling melancholy that was inherited here and there right through the generations of the Huxley family. Julian was especially publicly honest about this. And I think, having read my way through every declaration and investigation that he ever made about his own paralyzing depression, when I returned to this image of this delicate image, actually, of the grandfather and the grandson, I look at those hands placed carefully between the generations. And I think that that this studio portrait with soft hands covering and kind of claiming and seeking his grandfathers are quite poignant and painful, actually, because they this holds a truth. These men of science were privately tied together by their suffering, and publicly and professionally, they were tied together by Julian's own hand, by his scholarly work, by his will, as he actively pursued and grafted himself onto grandfather's lineage. But what agonized these Huxleys, and it did, what agonized them personally fascinated them equally intellectually. Their questions were, what do we inherit and what inheres in us? What happens over and between generations of living beings? So for me, writing these two natural scientists together permits a kind of as a historian who forever by temperament and I hope by training has been really interested in large and big temporal stories, for me, thinking of them together permits a kind of a time lapse over the 19th and 20th centuries, precisely because they were so similar. And in fact, I came to think of them as one very long-lived man, born in 1825, died in 1975, wonderful years. And these vital dates for me of this one very long-lived man bookended, truly colossal shifts in world history, from the age of sail to the space age, from colonial wars to world wars to the Cold War. From a time, and this is especially important for them as natural scientists, from a time when the Earth was 6,000 years old, according to Genesis, to a time when it was at least 4.5 billion years old, according to rock samples that had returned from the Apollo missions before Julian Huxley himself had died. So Thomas Henry Huxley may be familiar to many of you, and this portrait itself may be. He was, without doubt, patriarch of this scientific dynasty, one of the Victorian world's best-known zoologists and comparative anatomists. He doggedly promoted and defended Darwin in the earliest public dispute over the theory of evolution by natural selection. Well, this Huxley was up for the fight, no doubt about it. He sought it, he enjoyed it, he won it. This explosive idea of evolution by natural selection, in some ways, I think, was as suited to Huxley's character as it was sometimes a paralyzing ill match for Charles Darwin. And these two, I think, quite important etchings, and I'm looking at Jim Secord very closely here because I'm not sure these are in a Darwin-Huxley family home. I'm not actually sure they've been reproduced before. They're etchings of famous portraits that I had permission kindly from Angela Darwin to reproduce. But for me, as a pair, they catch the differences between these two very important scientific friends. It's a family portraitist, John Collier. He catches Darwin humbly holding his hat. No wonder we all love Darwin. Meanwhile, his bold, booming friend, Thomas Henry Huxley, stands there claiming the skull like it's the skull of every man. It's Huxley claiming the skull of every man like a sovereign holding an orb. The representative of God's dominion on earth is transformed here in this portrait into secular trustee of all humankind. And this cranium, this skull that he holds, was highly symbolic, as the family portraitist well knew. It was a symbol of Huxley's ascendancy over British natural sciences and a secular talisman, we might think, of Huxley's great intervention. Quote, evidence as to man's place in nature, his very important 1863 book. Well, Julian Huxley was a beneficiary of his grandfather's fights in the scientific and educational fields. A great rise over 2 generations in family fortunes saw young Julian here, first a student at Eton and then at Balliol from 1906. There, Oxford, 1906, natural sciences had completely transformed, and Julian learned evolutionary theory as a matter of course, not as a matter of controversy. But he also studied in that era the then strong critique amongst scientific discontents, not necessarily religious discontents, but scientific discontents about Darwin's idea. And so Julian Huxley, very interestingly, was raised, as he later put it, in the Mendelian epoch, when there were serious questions about Darwin's idea. So in tracking this rise and fall of both familiarity and favor, I suppose, of the idea of evolution by natural selection, it's in no sense through this family a straightforward progression. Well, in a really strange and remarkable turnaround, especially for those of us in the academic world, Julian Huxley traded in the microscope and the bench for paper and pen and typewriter and desk, as you see here. And we can put that down to the persuasive powers of larger-than-life H.G. Wells. Wells somehow persuaded Julian to give up his chair in zoology at King's College London for what we would now call a career in science communication. He gave up a salary for the rest of his life. He earned money by writing and speaking. He had a small salary with the London Zoo. He had a small salary for a couple of years with UNESCO. Other than that, this person is a writer who's making his money through his pen. But in being persuaded to give up King's College London with H.G. Wells, he traded in, a difficult job, and by his own account, he wasn't that good at lab bench science. Instead, perhaps unsurprisingly, he was thrown into this riotous world with H.G. Wells, where together they wrote this fabulous 3-volume book called The Science of Life, highly illustrated. They commissioned all these strange, bizarre illustrations. And Julian Huxley was able to just freely explore things as peculiar as the hypnosis of lobsters. And he thrived on it. And in the process, H.G. Wells taught him, it was a kind of an apprenticeship, actually. H.G. Wells taught him to cut 30,000 words down to 3, to make every word count, to use fabulous metaphors. And this phenomenon, I think, The Science of Life, this 3-volume beauty that David Attenborough also says launched his interest in zoology, in animals, was a fair trade, I would say. And Julian, to finish off his bio, he went on to become quite an adventurous communicator, actually, in media that were unimaginable to grandfather, in broadcasting, in film, and eventually in early television. And Julian Huxley, quite strangely, even won an Oscar for a natural history film. Along the way, and in between his own paralyzing depressions, Julian was a very controversial secretary of the London Zoo in the late 30s, an equally controversial Director General of UNESCO in the late 1940s. And in the subsequent decades, he was an A-list international speaker around questions of population control, birth control. This was a catastrophic era when the end of the world seemed imminent. So the likes of Julian Huxley and his family thought, along with many others. Ours is by no means the first generation to think this. Well, I suspect we'll talk shortly, and thanks to Sujit for taking some of this into a conversation. And I suspect we'll talk shortly about these Huxleys as human scientists of various orders. But I wanted to put on the table the extent to which signature Huxley projects, and in a way the one signature Huxley project, which was determining and fixing and substantiating man's place in nature, that required as much focus on non-humans as on Homo sapiens. Both the grandfather and the grandson were zoologists way before they were human scientists. They were enchanted by creatures of the sea and creatures of the sky, respectively. And they were also enchanted, again, respectively, by creatures that were dead, Thomas Henry Huxley, and creatures that were living, Julian Huxley. So Thomas Henry Huxley, the Victorian, learned most from dead animals and bits of them, from the fossils that showed the link between dinosaurs and birds, and from the many primate skulls sent to him as photographs, sometimes as casts, sometimes as actual human remains locally and from around the world. Well, Julian's world as a zoologist, by contrast, was vital and animate. For him, animals were best observed alive in really wonderful interaction with each other. He was an ethnographer of the animal world, an ethologist. And his first and enduring love affair was with birds. And still his best known zoological work remains a 1914 paper called The Courtship Habits of the Great Crested Grebe. Those enchanting symmetrical water birds, minimally sexually dimorphous. How then could Darwin's sexual selection theory make sense, was his question at the time. And it's still a much cited classic in ethology. So Julian animals were more than alive. They were not always wild or even faux wild, but he definitely preferred them living, moving, and in a kind of he would always say, in an emotional interaction with each other. If Thomas Henry Huxley lived and worked in a museum, Julian lived and worked in the London Zoo, in an apartment as the director. His grandfather had put a lot of store on that special African primate, the gorilla. T.H. Huxley had only ever seen it as a drawing or a skeleton or as pickled parts. Julian, by contrast, was captivated by, and I would like to say in love with, London Zoo's most famous gorilla, Guy. And this beautiful and magnificent photograph is by Wolfgang Suchitsky, courtesy of his son, Peter Suchitsky. And I know from the records, rather nicely for me as a biographer of the family, that just after Suchitsky, the same day that he took this photograph, he went to 31 Pond Street, Hampstead, and took a set of photographs, coincidentally, of the Huxley family. Julian Huxley, in this regard, I think, was more the intellectual grandson of Darwin than his own grandfather. The great evolutionist, of course, a century earlier, climbing into some of those very same Regent's Park cages to observe the expression of emotion. Well, Thomas Henry Huxley battled his whole life, as we know, for nature and for a strictly scientific method to understand it. A really important generation of scientific naturalists. The modernization of natural sciences, and he was a key player, probably even a dramaturg, I'd say. It challenged the sacred, the magical, the supernatural. It heralded the death of the divine. There are no spirits, no creator, at least none of which we can be sure, he would say, the inventor of the term agnostic. I always think that Huxley would have exclaimed with joy had he lived long enough to read the great scholarly debates that have unfolded about secularization and disenchantment over the 20th century. But he also, if we bring him forward in time, he also might have wondered why given that he gave to his family and in some ways gave to the world secularization, and definitely gave to the world the idea of agnostics, he might also wonder why then this biologist grandson, Julian, was so drawn by sacred idols, why he studied parapsychology, why Julian Huxley wondered occasionally about ghosts, why the literary grandson, Aldous, sought radically other perceptions and doors to them. Not to mention his anthropologist great-grandson, Julian's son, Francis Huxley, who became so hopelessly, we might say, immersed in the magical and the mystical, in voodoo, that was his specialty, and in rituals of sacralization, to become himself a high animist. And for me, one of the joys, and in a way the great gift to me in writing the story of this family, was Francis Huxley, the hidden Huxley, who I actually think is the greatest wordsmith of them all. And he was unsurprisingly, a zoology student in wartime Oxford. After that, he was an anthropologist with Evans Pritchard, and he just wrenched himself from zoology, not only into cultural anthropology of that school, but later into deep London psychoanalysis with R.D. Laing. So in the kind of nature culture story, Francis Huxley, who ends up writing these books like The Age of the Way of the Sacred, is a kind of a gift to me, and an unexpected one. Over 4 generations then of modernity, the agnostic Huxleys searched for something to put in the place of the divine, compatible with grandfather's scientific naturalism, but somehow exceeding it. And Julian, I think, ended up actually not a kind of a neo-romantic scientist, actually quite technically a neo-romantic scientist, complete with visions, complete with poetry. Julian sometimes even imagined himself as a kind of a uppercase creator who bestowed his own word, uppercase, on humankind. And that word from him was evolutionary humanism. Sometimes I would imagine him thinking of himself as a kind of a Moses, authoring this new scientific religion for the world, evolutionary humanism. And for him, this truth would certainly not be acquired from heaven, but instead from earth, from nature itself. Well, for the Victorian Huxley, agnosticism about a soul didn't in any sense mean he wasn't interested in feeling or in emotions or the senses. On the contrary, for the Victorian Huxley, consciousness and perception and sense and sensation were all fascinating as a physiologist and a learned philosopher of mind, which he was, not just as a comparative anatomist. The Victorian Huxley, T.H. Huxley, really was a relentless inquirer into the mind and the brain, what happens inside those many skulls that surrounded him, how he thinks, perceives, feels, and how we do that similarly to other animals. Well known as a founder of British anthropology, which he was quite technically, Thomas Henry Huxley, he started the Institute. He was also part of the beginning of psychology in this country. So in one line of the family of Huxleys is this interest in physiology of feeling, if I might put it that way. And it manifested in one generational line through to Andrew Huxley, well known in Cambridge, of course, as Master of Trinity, and Nobel Prize winner on the physiology of nerve impulses. Andrew Huxley was Julian and Aldous' half-brother. But in this other line, let's call it Julian and Aldous' line, the grandfather's studies of consciousness and unconsciousness, of mesmerism and hypnotism and anesthesia and reflex, led to the analysis of a 20th century phenomenon called the unconscious. And they were of a generation, and certainly for Julian Huxley, he absolutely consumed Freud. By the 1950s and 60s, the Huxley brothers, Julian and Aldous, were actively wondering about altering consciousness and perception through telepathy, through Vedanta, through mescaline and LSD. The brother here, I think of this is also another portrait, incidentally, on your left by Wolfgang Suchitsky. This was the portraitist, the photographer of Guy the Gorilla. On the left, Julian, and on the right, Aldous. I think of them as the talker and the listener. The brother who lived in edgy California was a practitioner, fully immersed in experimental experience. The brother who lived in cozy Hampstead was a philosopher, we might say, of new kinds of human perception at one remove. And it's well known that Aldous Huxley asked for and received an injection of LSD at the point of his last breath. It's less well known that his psychoanalyst wife called this a sacrament. Well, all of these Huxleys, they looked to outer worlds, they looked to inner worlds, and they sometimes looked to other worlds. They really were cosmologists of sorts. And over their lifespans, time got longer and longer, the past deeper and deeper. In the 20th century, Julian and Aldous shared visions of all kinds of possible new worlds, political new worlds, an intellectual and a fraternal intimacy of really quite a profound order. Well, these Huxleys, so why have I written about them? Last week, a good scholarly friend, or so I thought she was, someone with whom I enjoyed and was tested in that wonderful scholarly moment of the 1990s when we were all reading post-colonial scholarship and feminist scholarship. And we've been friends ever since. And she said to me last week, "What? Another Bashford book on great white men? What happened to our training?" And then she said to me, "Not only that, but we have to read about great white men and their pre-human ancestors." And then she said to me, "But hang on, they're not even great white men, they're mediocre white men." And then I really took offense. And I took offense on behalf of Thomas Henry Huxley, who would be apoplectic at the idea that anybody had called him mediocre. But it's quite true that Thomas Henry Huxley and his high masculinity had to wait his turn on my desk. He would never be able to understand why he had to wait, and especially he had to wait on my desk for me to finish with the Reverend Malthus. And there was always something delightful about making Thomas Henry wait until Malthus, my previous book, was finished. But the thing about these Huxleys is that great modern matters were their intellectual business, that they carried forward generationally. This was nature culture business they worked through as a family of poets and filmmakers, as a family of antiquarians and futurists, a family of neo-romantics and agnostics, of wordsmiths and natural scientists. The stakes of all of their work possibly couldn't be higher. They were biologists of human difference. They were biologists of race and sex, and they were political biologists too, and explicitly so. These Huxleys dealt with life on Earth in every scale imaginable. They were hardly modest thinkers. They thought from the solar system to the soul in orders massive and minute. The grandfather had compiled Evidences to Man's Place in Nature in 1863. And when he wrote that, he was looking backwards to an evolutionary past that was receding before his eyes, before everyone's eyes, with every paleontological discovery. And one century later, 1963, his grandson considered the future of man, he wrote in one book, evolutionary aspects. And he thought the 1960s, he was looking forward to the future of man from what he called a crucial moment in the cosmic story, not just the historical story. But Julian Huxley was so far inside nature as to be in charge of it, so he would think, to have a kind of a dominion over it. And he wrote, quote, "Man's destiny is to be the sole agent for the future evolution of this planet. We, stand alone as trustees of evolution," he thought, "since we alone can comprehend evolution. We're the only species who can. So therefore we are its trustees." That was his ongoing evolutionary humanist argument. On the one hand, I think this was a new kind of dominion over the fish of the sea, over the fowl of the air, and over every living thing that moveth upon the earth. On the other hand, this is Julian Huxley as a commentator and a theorist of an imperiled global ecology. And I think that the resonance with our own Anthropocene is a true one. So I'm looking forward to conversation with you all and with Sujit, but I'm delighted, of course, that Huxleys are in print again, and they would expect no less. Thank you.
So it just seems the other day, actually, that we were gathered here at Jesus College for the launch of Alison's co-written book, The New Worlds of Thomas Malthus. So I should really begin by congratulating her. Huge congratulations on completing yet another excellent book, and so quickly as well. But this book shows sustained and deeply considered engagement with the voluminous Huxley archive and that of other organizations and other people who turn up into view as well. It goes beyond text to insightful commentary, as you've seen just now, on many visual illustrations, and also into objects. One of my favorite moments, I'm glad to hear that this might be something Alison's interested in, is the discussion of the cast of Huxley's hand as an object, juxtaposed against the representations of Julian's hands and his engagement, Julian's engagement with palmistry, then set within broader accounts of simian hands and human hands and their differences. It's a really hefty book. There's a lot in it. It keeps going and going with yet more and yet more creative insights and perspectives on the Huxley family within broader formations of modern science and social sensibility. And one can actually, if one knows Alison, one can hear Alison's voice throughout, and various Alison phrases, which we know in Cambridge. And I say this just as a compliment in the sense that the book is boldly set out and written without, and here's something I can aspire to, without any flowery language. It's actually kind of really, really readable and enjoyable. So what is the argument of an intimate history of evolution? I guess the title leads us straight to it. One way to read the book is that it suggests a parallelism. There is the intimate politics and relations of a family over 3 generations, and in particular, the symmetry and dissonance between 2 members of that family, and we've heard of them already, Thomas and Julian. Then there are the changes in the sciences. We move from Thomas, who represents comparative anatomy and zoology, put together with his work at the Royal School of Mines, or what became Imperial College, London, and also his scientific naturalism and commitment to natural selection, to Julian, the science communicator, geneticist, advocate at the London Zoo, early driver of UNESCO's statements on race, and post-war president of the British Eugenics Society. So Alison puts it very succinctly: the family history of the Huxley family doubles as an account of evolving ideas about generations, genealogy, genes, and eugenics. So this broad brush story might imply a teleology of the sciences, science becoming more modernized, becoming free of the hold of theology, the field of nature becoming more and more cultured, and so on. But Alison's really too clever to go for that route, and this was evident in what she said just earlier. Rather, she often casts the story in reverse. Julian re-enchanted the sciences that Thomas had aimed to disenchant. Some forms of spiritualism come back into the picture. Additionally, there are important continuities, given present debates on the legacies of scientific racism. Bashford argues that both grandfather and grandson were, to an extent, anti-racists of different kinds. So I have three kinds of questions to ask, which I place for clarity under three headings. My first set of questions sits under, this is an anti-biographical biography. So Alison, it really strikes me that you've written a whole series of biographies, Griffith Taylor, Malthus, now the Huxleys, and each of them seems quite different. The Malthus book was very much a history of the reception of the text, Essay on the Principle of Population. It was determinedly non-European, in the sense that you argued with Joyce Chaplin, your co-author, that Malthus's writing was shaped by various new worlds of colonialism. An intimate history of evolution is different again. Various texts that have appeared today, Evidence as to Man's Place in Nature by Thomas, the incredible collaboration which we heard about between H.G. Wells and Julian Huxley, which gave rise to Science of Life, Julian writing on overpopulation for Playboy. But an intimate history of evolution is not about the text and the death of the author. You explain that the subject is one very long-lived man, the merging of Thomas and Julian into one, elongated masculinity. For this reason, it isn't organized chronologically. The reader is always dealing, quite helpfully, with the decentering of these two men by each other, but also importantly by various women and men who appear into view from time to time and who are in sexual and intimately friendly relationships with them. So what sort of genre of biography is this? And is it fair for me to call it anti-biographical? I do so because one reading might imply that it is their modes of reproduction and familial kinship that are as agentic as either of these men. If not, how to explain the centrality of one family to the emergence of the sciences, which is one of the arguments of the book. Secondly, I suggest, and this is not the same as your post-colonial friend, this is an anti-heroic history of the male scientist. It seems that we've gone full circle in the history of the sciences. When I was studying it by people, at the hands of people here, I received teaching on why the white male scientists needed to be dislodged by women, by technicians, by artisans, by colonized peoples, by mediators, by printers, by readers, and so on and so on. If so, Alison returns us to the white male scientist, but she does so with an unflinchingly rounded view of them. The Huxleys, as we've heard, are neurotic, obsessive, depressive, and this runs all the way right through the family, from Thomas's grandfather, I think George, Thomas writing of his love for Henrietta as an illness, manic depression as a category that they utilize, and most distressingly with the suicide in the family as well. So the emotional turbulence of the Huxleys is also graphically represented in Julian's long affair, which features in this book, which family members saw as an insanity, with the politically articulate and youthful Viola Ilma. She wrote, "Julian, you have ruined so much of my life. God, I want to die." So meanwhile, Alison is very keen to emphasize a contrarian view of male-on-male relationships too. In this sense, in the book, they're highly emotive, they're highly expressive. So this takes us very far away from the view of Thomas as, and this is a phrase that perhaps many of us know, Darwin's bulldog. Additionally, these various conditions of consciousness and depression allowed the Huxleys to become theorists of court, sense, sensibility, perception, evolutionary psychology, psychopharmacology, and even parapsychology. The male scientist as anti-hero appears also in the middle part of the book, which is about human-animal relations. And of course, predictably, I really enjoyed this, going from Thomas and jellyfish to Julian and grebes and gorillas. Here, Guy becomes a subject in his own right and stares down Julian. Julian writes, here I cite, "If we could only get through the barrier of non-communication set up by their inability to talk, gorillas, what strange areas of subhuman, deleted mind we could explore." So this mirrors Julian's growing environmentalism and interest in interspecies relations, and also how the human-animal boundary disturbs human heterosexuality. So is this all part of the antitype of the lone male scientist as genius? And how far does the book want to present itself as such? And thirdly, and very briefly, this is a British history written by a world historian. Alison has now shown in distinguished style that if British historians wish to be world historians can also write really good British history. It's a deep analysis of a particular kind of British family formation, rocked by challenges, but still committed to carrying on regardless, riveted by characteristically empiricist observation of nature, which one might see to be central to a British tradition of science. Would that be fair? Not to trade in historiographical stereotypes, but it would be fascinating to consider whether there is an equivalent French or German family. More broadly, I was waiting to see when and how the wider world emerged in this book, partly because of Alison's previous commitment to local and global histories of quarantine, for instance. For Thomas, this is clearly the Pacific, he was voyaging. Julian, it's Africa. And the change arguably is from an imperial Thomas to an internationalist Julian. For the elder Huxley, there was very little direct engagement or exchange. And indeed, at one violent moment when he was voyaging on the Rattlesnake, there was firing, and he actually wanted more firing. Later, he asked for naked photographs of indigenous bodies from the Colonial Office to make anthropometric types. He preferred a civilizational distance from people of the wider world, but was definitely not polygenic. The younger Huxley was a more cultural anthropologist committed to world citizenship and cosmopolitan oneness, and critical of the rise of new nation states and radical democracy. As Alison explains, anti-fascism, not anti-imperialism, was his route to internationalism. Africa figured in Julian's journeys to evangelize on world conservation. They were sponsored by the colonial state, and he found it quite difficult to shed the hierarchies of the old order. So on my reading, this book cannot be a global history because there is a shallowness of interest in the wider world amongst the Huxleys. Is that the right reading? So those are three sorts of questions, but I want to end really by saying that the book has raised so many questions because its method, its subject, and its reach are really quite unorthodox. And for that, Alison, many congratulations. This is where we go into conversation mode, but maybe I should just begin by asking Alison what she thinks, I mean, maybe you could reflect actually on how different this book is to Malthus, and also whether you do see it as a biography or what kind of biography it is.
Thank you. I never imagined myself as a biographer, actually. And then it turns out that I keep on writing these books about, you know, but I write books about the people who have really big ideas. And I think it's one way. Maybe I can't continue to do this as I look at the Penguin publisher over there. Maybe I can. But I do think that the people that I'm interested in, it's a way to anchor those huge ideas. And for me, that's what the Huxleys provided. They provided more than originally a kind of a device to think about those huge questions of all of everything I just said over the 19th and 20th century, and they would be able to anchor it. But then I think they kind of took over, and I did it with things that I didn't expect. I didn't expect the return of that space, that spiritual space that they're hankering after. I didn't expect the great-grandson to write books on the age of the sacred. And so the usual stories, you know, in some ways, it's a plain historical method of reading carefully what your sources say. So when you do that quite preliminary research in some ways of thinking, what are the books that these people write? The fact that the most recent Huxley in that line of, you know, agnostic secularists and humanists write a book called The Age of the Sacred. That's when they started taking over. So, you know, it's still, I have to confess, I did go into Waterstones to see where Waterstones had put the book. And it is both in science and it's in biography. And the science I understand. The biography placement, of course, I understand, but it takes me a little by surprise.
But in some ways, you're pushing against the form of the biography in the juxtaposition of many members and also moving across time. And so is it right to see the family and the kind of the kinly relations, the reproductive relations as really driving the story in some ways?
Yes, it did, but it's less because I start from wanting to write a history of the family, and more that that's their scientific business. So all of the work around the intimate as well as the intellectual discussion about reproduction and kinship and sex and race and everything that goes along with that was with, you know, in a way, every family does it. Every family does life, birth, death, love, tragedy. But not every family are scientific experts in it and make their money from communicating it. And so in a way, I come kind of backwards, I suppose, not from the idea of a biography or even a family out, but kind of backwards from wanting to write about those ideas as they changed over the 19th and 20th centuries.
Great. And so just to kind of move on, I wonder whether you could place this work in the history of science. And really, I mean, I suppose a previous wave of scholarship, which has moved to less elite agents and intermediaries and mediators and so on. So is it the case that actually this book is made possible by that previous scholarship? So in a sense, we're kind of coming back again to subjects in a new way. And if so, how is this different to kind of a heroic scientist and their biography? So I suppose I'm just wondering where you kind of place it historiographically, since you're interested in historiography
I'm really
in the history of science.
Yes, thank you, Sujit. So it never occurs to me not to write anything. You know, it never occurs to me just because there's a tradition of writing about famous scientists that was problematic at one point that I wouldn't either, if they're fascinating, I go there, you know. So I'm never worried actually about, you know, well, I suppose it also comes from a confidence that given my 1990s golden era, as I always think of it, forwards training, it's unlikely that I'm going to write the same kind of a story, because, you know, the old I do think that actually biography sits in the history of science quite centrally, as does the history of ideas. I think the history of science is a place where writing about what people have thought has been core business from the beginning, and so it absolutely sits in that space, but it never either worries me or I never feel, rightly or wrongly, I never feel troubled or beholden,
No, sure.
as opposed to what I should write.
Yeah, but you're also sort of bringing in all these points about the emotional relations of men and the different states of consciousness and so forth. So I suppose it's not a kind of heroic view of the scientist,
Yeah.
right? So it's sort of a totally different kind of view.
I suppose so, but I think in some ways what's interesting to me is that in that sense, it's more purely empirical, because the men themselves wrote about these things. And so the fact that, you know, other historians haven't been interested, the fact that, you know, Julian Huxley or the Huxley family were very explicit about their emotional lives, and the suicidal brother, and the, you know, how we think about a physiology of feeling and, you know, an emotional world. That was in fact, you know, let's say 30% of what they themselves wrote about. And so there's, in some ways, it's more straightforward in terms of allowing the interest that they themselves had, which may have been curious for the time, into the analysis, rather than in fact doing what I think is often an empirical error and it's insufficient to write a history that is actually set to one side. So in some ways, it's a straightforward reading, actually, of what's on the page.
So just to kind of flesh out the kind of historiographical placement, I mean, one thing I wondered about is how you'd contrast this with Adrian Desmond's T.H. Huxley, Devil's Disciple, Evolution's High Priest, I think.
Yes.
Because this is a very different kind of thing, right? So how is it different, do you think, from?
Yes, no,
Adrian
now
Desmond's
that's a really good question. And I'm such a, I remember reading Adrian Desmond's wonderful biography of Thomas Henry Huxley a long time ago. I think when I did even an undergraduate essay on the Huxleys, if I remember correctly. And now when I reread it, it's the most superb piece of writing. How is it different? I think that how is it different? Well, it's different because it's intergenerational. It's different because it moves into the 20th century. It is shaped by our generation's interest in human and non-human animals and relations between them. So Julian Huxley doesn't just get to be director of the London Zoo. This is someone who actually, as an ethologist, is an antecedent in scholarly terms to our generation's interest in humans and animals. And so in some ways, a lot of those more common or more current, lines are in there.
From memory, it's kind of through class analysis, right?
Yes.
So in a sense, this is a slightly different.
Yes.
This is more intersectional in various ways.
It is intersectional, and I think that there is I hope an awareness of class in this, because it's unmistakable in the Huxley story. What we haven't discussed so far is that Thomas Henry Huxley is, it's an anti-Darwin story or an opposite to the Darwin story. Thomas Henry Huxley comes from extremely struggling family. That he's raised outside London. They moved to Coventry, middle class, but socially declining, not much money at all. And he's a medical apprentice from when he's 13. And so this is an unusual self-made story with the strongest will of any historical character I think I've ever written about, who is miserable as a poor 13-year-old. Can you imagine, in the Docklands in the East End in London? He hated it, dissecting and dispensing by day, and by night he would light his candle and he would learn ancient Greek and impeccable German and philosophy and read his way through natural history. So there is an interesting class and intellectual story where for the rest of his life he is opposed to any kind of appointment that is via any mechanism except scholarly worth and virtue. So I hope that's class there, but definitely I think that era, that is a difference between
bringing the
Desmond's
animals
and
in
mine.
is a sort of big difference, I think, because it's the book clearly shows the imprint of the non-human tone in many ways. I wonder whether you could comment on global history and, in a sense, the absence of global history in this book, and why, and is it right to read this as an analysis of Britishness and a British tradition of science or not? I mean, would the same be found elsewhere in Europe, for instance, in relation to family histories of science?
I don't quite understand your question actually about the rest of Europe.
Yeah, so would there be, I mean, is this a sort of particularly sort of British family tradition of where you kind of observe the family and observe nature and the two things work together like this? So is it particularly British, or is it sort of, can you generalize, would the same thing happen, say, with, I don't know, I mean, should we bring to mind Alexander von Humboldt or someone like this?
Yes.
Too, or
I actually don't see why not. I don't think the specifics of the story is deeply British, and it is to some extent an imperial, in a true way, an imperial story rather than a post-colonial history of this knowledge. It is that. Very happy for it to be that. I'm proudly eclectic as a historian. I think as a discipline and personally, we can take different methods, different styles, different topics, different eras, different people, different locations, and live our wonderful lives as historian. Why can't we do this? I think that when I started this, I imagined it as a way into imperial history or imperial science turned into internationalist science, that it was a driving idea when I first started thinking about writing the Huxleys. And I think that there's remnants of that there. And you're quite right, Sujit, to indicate that two great regions of the world, which are interestingly inverse to one another, the South Sea, the Pacific, for Thomas Henry Huxley, who spends 4 or 5 years there in the 1840s, and Africa, the whole continent. And he goes from one end to the other and crosses it every which way in the 20th century for Julian Huxley. And these two places form their science, form their politics. Does that cross over to being a global history of the idea of evolution? No. Does it want to or need to be? No.
Is that a reflection of them as well? And the way they're engaging with these places? Yes,
I would say so. And I think that, to the extent that I almost wanted to put in some map. Everybody loves a map at the beginning of a book. It didn't, still pleased by the book. It didn't happen. But when I was thinking about what parts of the world are involved here, there is a great 20th century Soviet and Russian story to this. This is deeply about the politics of the early 20th century and the interwar period. But what I wanted to say was, when I started to think about maps, I was almost as interested in a map of London as I was in a map of the world, or that in fact it needed both, and happily so.
That proves my point that it's British history.
Absolutely British history. This is a fine thing. I'm no longer V. Harmsworth Chair of Imperial Naval History. And And in some ways another edition there may be of Map of London that is about, this neighborhood of Thomas Henry Huxley in St. John's Wood, wherever it is British. There's George Eliot. There's all these, there's Herbert Spencer down the road. He and Herbert Spencer walk by most evenings. They spend their time walking through Regent's Park, discussing this strange idea of evolution. And then, 70 years later, Julian Huxley is living there in Regent's Park. On his death, it's quite a London story, actually. On his death in 1970s, Julian Huxley, we have really quite difficult to read letters where he lives right on Hampstead Heath for most of his adult life, goes walking every day. And in 1973, there's a letter where he comes home and he writes to an ethologist friend, the grebes have come back for the first time in 50 years to Hampstead Heath. And I write in the book about how, in a way, this is the grebes bidding him farewell because he dies soon after. But this is a British family within so many ways, a truly London outwards history.
That's really helpful. I'm going to pass back to Julian, actually, because we should open up.
Thank you. It's been hugely fascinating. I've loved hearing about this sort of 150-year period. But there are some questions in online, and I suspect there are some questions in the room as well. So if you do have a question here, if you just put your hand up, we'll get one of our a microphone over to you. There's one right at the back over there, which we'll take first, and I'll bring some in online.
Listen, I'm fascinated by the whole thing. I'm interested to the extent to which the later Huxleys intentionally go back to look at sort of questions that the earlier Huxleys raised. It doesn't seem to me that's the case in many British families, that we go back and look at the questions our grandparents raised and want to specifically answer them. So do you feel that was sort of what was going on in the Huxleys? They were looking inwardly, or they equally did that outwardly, but the more interesting questions that they took with them were the internal ones.
Yes, that's interesting. And hello. I think that it starts from the questions being so enormous in the first place. So that you have this patriarch of a scientific dynasty moving from a pre-Darwinian world to a high Darwinian world, where he's asking and intervening in the biggest possible questions there are. And so in some ways, it is quite true that Julian in particular, Andrew Huxley in a strange way in his physiology continues, as I indicate, some of this work, but doesn't ask the same kind of cosmological questions that Julian Huxley asks. Is that idiosyncratic? Possibly, quite possibly. But therein for me lay my device of the one long-lived man who is asking the same questions. And for me, I think that was the richness and the delight and the possibility, was that there are these two trained zoologists asking very similar questions, but in completely different worlds, in different political worlds, in different scientific worlds. And that was a kind of a device, I suppose, initially to track through. But perhaps it is an unusual thing.
Any others in the room? Yeah, at the front there, and then I'll take one from online.
Hi, Alison. Just thank you. This book sounds wonderful. To follow on, actually, in a way from that question, you talked a couple of times about the ways of the sacred. Francis, this third, fourth generation, perhaps. Do you see that in a way as also pursuing the agenda, or at some points at one point you seemed to be suggesting it was a kind of a break and very different, but I was wondering whether it was actually pursuing the same agenda. And I suppose the evidential issue that occurs to me as maybe sort of being able to work that out is to what extent any of the Huxleys might have been interested in early cave art and cave representational painting, because that is, in a sense, for for a dynasty that's interested in the mind and how the mind of humans might have been, might be leaving us evidence to interpret it from as early as we can possibly get. That was, I think that is the obvious evidence they might have gone to. So with your knowledge of TH and Julian, were they addressing that kind of evidence ever in their careers? And if not, was Francis perhaps interested in it and so on?
Thank you, Simon. T.H. Huxley was right at that beginning moment of in fact, what we used to call prehistory. We don't call it prehistory anymore, but he was really right at the center of that, very learned antiquarian world where artifacts, did it include cave painting? I'm not sure, but how we think backwards to a moment where culture and nature kind of meet was deeply part of his expertise and interest. Julian pulled that forward, and there's vast amounts of the science of life, for example, which are precisely about, they're really interested in human, pre-human ancestors' points of definition and crossover, and how we might, where we might put that. And so all of that material and that whole idea of how we think about pre-humans and where and what the pre is was deeply part of their scholarship. Francis Huxley is super, super interesting in my view. And I think that he's a continuation because he doesn't shy away from, and he relishes and lives inside the biggest human questions possible. And like the others, had far from having any problem, enjoyed and couldn't stop actually thinking from interior selves to cosmologies. And so in that sense, he's a continuation. But actually more to Sujit's point, it's in Francis Huxley that we get an expert, a real expert, not a dabbling like T.H. Huxley was, in Buddhism, for example, in Hinduism. Francis Huxley, as a cultural anthropologist, in that book, The Age of the Sacred, is in fact doing a world history of ideas of what the sacred means and how it is materialized in art, in cave paintings, in statues, in texts, in paper. That's what that book is, and he's quite learned about it, and he pulls many, many different knowledges together. And what's interesting is that, of course, I was looking for where and when in The Age of the Sacred does Thomas Henry Huxley come up, but evolutionary theory itself as a way to understand humans, non-humans, the world, life, gets about 3 sentences, about very mediocre 2/3 of the way through the book. So in a way, it's acknowledged as a way of understanding these things, but nowhere near as interesting. So it's completely diminished. So his family inheritance of the life sciences gets a very, very small look in compared to all of the other knowledge that he's trying to collect. So in that respect, nothing like it. In the respect of another Huxley with this massive capacity and ambition and fearlessness about writing about everything, with a much more global gathering of knowledges, it's a continuation.
So can I bring in, I'll keep an eye out for questions here, but can I bring in a question online from Nick Matzke, who says, in December 2021, T.H. Huxley's name was removed from the Huxley College of Environmental Science at Western Washington University. The allegation was racism and eugenics. The administration totally ignored Huxley's anti-slavery, his support for the Jamaica Committee, and his general liberalism. A similar effort at Imperial College was only barely defeated after scientists organized a last-minute defense. What do you think about these events, and are the Huxleys as bad as slaveholders?
Okay, so all of that is true, and that's an unsurprising question that comes a lot up, quite rightly, with respect to the Huxleys. And many of us know that it's still very live in Imperial College, and Imperial College still does have a Huxley building, as does UCL, as do many other places. And in my mind, quite interestingly, and quite usefully as a way forward. Imperial College, as I understand it, have decided to do a dual move forward, which is to retain the Huxley name and add something to it. And so I'm quite interested in that, not necessarily because that what some people see as a compromise, what I see is actually in this instance quite a useful way forward. Partly because it's not entirely clear with Thomas Henry Huxley what's going on there, because is it easy within a nanosecond to find evidence of Thomas Henry Huxley's bigotry? Yes. Anybody can do that anytime. It didn't need my expertise or anybody else's expertise to show this. Entirely clear, entirely evident, entirely problematic. Was Thomas Henry Huxley also opposed to slavery? Yes. Here's the harder question. Should we always think of being opposed to slavery as easily or in a straightforward manner being anti-racist? No, I don't think those two things historically are necessarily the same thing at all. And I'm so pleased to see my American history colleagues, I think, nodding. And I think that that error is often made, that people think anti-racism and being opposed to slavery in different eras historically are necessarily the same thing. And it's quite hard to understand why that's not necessarily the case. So T.H. Huxley sits in that domain, and it's absolutely correct. People often don't know, as the questioner, thank you, knows that T.H. Huxley also sat on the committee in London that was assessing the Morant Bay Rebellion, terrible unfolding events in Jamaica in the 1860s that were ruthlessly and in a very bloody way put down. And the British governor was charged, and Britain and London was split down the middle in defence or not of the reprisal, I suppose, of the British governor. And Thomas Henry Huxley, along with John Stuart Mill, represented a liberal position, entirely supporting the charging of the British governor for the bloody suppression of the so-called revolt in Jamaica. And so there's another instance of this actually quite complicated Thomas Henry Huxley. And, since we're on the topic, it's even more the case with Julian Huxley, who, writes ridiculously superior books about, and colonial books about Africa. That's easy to find and easy to critique, and important to do so, of course. At the same time, as Sujit indicated, and as I write in the book, he's a driver behind the UNESCO statements on race. Perhaps more importantly than that, it's Julian Huxley in the 1930s who writes with Alfred Court Haddon a really blistering attack on Nazi, fascist, racist dogma in the hugely important book, We Europeans. And that's when Julian Huxley starts to put the word race in inverted commas, and that is something that importantly falls down to our own day. So in some ways, the case is even more trickier with Julian, because there's no doubt that the man, in my view, that the man was one of the 20th century's more important anti-racists. He undid the idea of race as a biological category with the help of the population geneticists of his generation. At the same time, he's president of the Eugenics Society. And he's president of the Eugenics Society in 1959 to 1962, right at the period when you think if any generation is going to distance itself, an anti-racist is going to distance themselves from eugenics, it's the post-war generation. But no, Julian Huxley was both a very important anti-racist and an entire defender of eugenics until the day he died. So putting these things together, if I may humbly say so, requires certain historical explanation. And it is the case, if I may just say one more word on this, that it's not always fashionable or popular to make a business of explaining these matters. And some people will say to me, colleagues will say to me, oh, you're explaining it away. But I take issue with that very strongly. And I think that one's job as a historian is precisely to do the explaining.
Thank you. We have time for maybe one or two more questions. This block is allowed to ask questions as well. But I'll take the one at the back and then see how we are for time.
Thanks, Alison, for the book, and thank you both for the conversation. I wanted to ask not about the subject, about the Huxleys, but about the form and about the writing process. Sujit asked you about Adrian Desmond as a possible antecedent, and kind of I wondered whether you had any other kind of models for the kind of biographical project that you're undertaking, or actually models, examples of books you knew, if you want to say that, kind of that you didn't want to follow. And in terms of the writing, I mean, how did you, were you following a particular kind of idea of what the book should look like? Did you have a prior sense of how you wanted the story to unfold? Or were you, as I think you kind of intimated, were you sort of following the material where it led you and kind of weaving together as it went? Yeah, I mean, how did you how did it come about, the book?
Thank you. And thank you for the Writers' Festival style question. So we're all writers here and we love to talk about our process. What a joy it was to write this book. The material just, the characters just fell out of the page. You couldn't ask for more driven and bold, someone who booms through the records like Thomas Henry Huxley, in a way made me, writing about Malthus was not exciting. No wonder I wrote about the book, not the man. Everybody liked the man, but he was not especially riveting. By contrast, and I feel terrible saying that because he was, of course, an old fellow of this college. By contrast, the Huxley families just tumble out of the records and T.H. Huxley just booms out. And at the same time, Julian Huxley is a very different personality, much less sure of himself. And in a way, I think I write somewhere in the book, he's at a biographical disadvantage because his whole circle with his beloved brother Aldous were the poets and the painters and the professional introspectors and writers, the cultural luminaries of that interwar generation. And they all write about him. So he's kind of at a disadvantage. And one very important, and he probably has relations, affairs with most of them, and they end up not liking him very much, so they write not very good things. But this all gives one enormous amount of material. And one very important American poet, this is on the public record, May Sarton, was a lover at one point. They go their separate ways. She ends up being far more in love with Juliet, his wife, through their whole lives than Julian. And after Julian Huxley's death, May Sarton, very well-known, important American poet, and Juliet say, what do you think, what was he really like? And May Sarton says, well, I think he was a very spoiled baby person. So that is to say that there was certainly no scrounging through the records here. Boy, did I do a lot of archival research. But as soon as you opened any folder, any document, it just fell out. In terms of models, Andrea Wolf's book on Humboldt is a very different kind of more global traveling book, but it's a book that I read and reread, and I think she's an extraordinary writer of scientific lives. And I was delighted actually when for one of the Penguin endorsements that and Andrea seemed pleased that in fact I'd not written chronologically but had written thematically, and that was always going to be the intention. There was never going to be from a beginning to the end of the period model for this book.
So I think I might finish with one final question from online, perhaps maybe a long one, maybe a brief one. Alison, what's next?
I didn't plant that question, no. And you're going to have to watch the time now. So okay, I'm going to make this really short. Julian Huxley's papers are in Rice University, Texas. I've spent a long time in Houston, and as all the historians here will realize, the delight of opening the folder and something falls out that you can't explain and is weird. So what happened to me one day in Houston was I opened yet another folder of these vast Huxley records, and it was a picture of photographs of Aldous Huxley's hands, this way and this way, and then Julian Huxley's hands, and then the sons had this whole folder of these beautiful, I would say 1930s close-ups, very professionally taken, quite beautiful portraits really of hands. And I thought, what are they about? Once I scraped the surface there, it turns out that Aldous, unsurprisingly, was deeply into palmistry. Julian, much more interestingly, was working with the photographer of the hands and a German Jewish refugee, medically trained psychoanalyst, who invented the idea, the term, the simian line. And the simian line, this is what the next book might be about. Palm reading turns into medical genetics. And this, you know, isn't it the delight in this job that we have where the happenstance of the opening of a folder yields this thing that it's always what you can't explain, isn't it? You know, that you open the folder and you think, well, that's the weirdest thing. After all these years, I've got no way of explaining it. And that's the point at which you think there may be the next book. So with any luck, there's a strange history of the hand coming out that is about early modern chiromancy and palmistry, all the way to, it's like a serious history of the hand, all the way to medical genetics in the middle of the 20th century.
Fantastic. Well, I'm sure I speak for everybody and say I look forward to reading it when it's developed and being a bit more written. But thank you very, very much, Alison. Thank you very, very much, Sujit. That was really amazing.